We're very pleased to have Victoria Hills, the Chief Executive of the World Town Planning Institute and soon to be CEO of the Chartered Institute of Building. Victoria has over 26 years experience in planning, transport, regeneration and regional government. She worked for all three mayors of London, the first two alongside me, of which I have very fond memories. While at the GLA, she led the establishment of the UK's largest regeneration project at Old Oak, setting up the Old Oak and Park Royal Mayoral Development Corporation. And now, using the convening role of the Royal Town Planning Institute, Victoria advocates for resourcing planning and putting planning at the heart of delivery for quality places. She's driving forward delivery of the RTPI strategic plan for the 27,000 members in the UK and globally, focusing on raising the profile of the work of planners, reaffirming the respect for and the value of the profession, and attracting a diverse and inclusive profession, increasing membership during her time there. Victoria has been a member of the Government's Office for Place Advisory Board. She currently sits on the Advisory Board for Black Professionals in Construction, the Advisory Board on the Greener Transport Council, and chairs the Essex Climate Action Commission's Net Zero Innovation Network. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Victoria with a reminder to you all to put any questions for her under the Q&A tab. And you can also vote for others' questions in there as well. And if you've got any wider thoughts, there's an option in the WooClap link to put any wider thoughts. Brilliant. Over to you, Victoria.
Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for the warm welcome, and congratulations to all those members who have just been recognised for your outstanding contributions. The topic is making planning deliver for the environment, and I think it's fair to say that it is quite a hot topic at the moment, and very timely to have the opportunity to come and talk to you here this morning, because I suspect many of you are not my members, and I always say that planners are very good talking to other planners, but what we need to do more is reach out beyond the professional boundaries, and collaboration is very much going to be a key part of that going forward. Planning gives a voice to those who do not have a voice. Particularly, the environment doesn't have a voice, it can't speak for itself. And so for many years, planning has done a magnificent job of protecting the environment. Some of you may disagree on individual case studies, but broadly speaking, when you travel around the British Isles, you can see that we've not done a too bad job at protecting the environment. But the focus now is moving on to improving the environment, as well as the challenges and pressure for growth and development do not continue to slow down, and broader challenges are there, whether they be climate or the biodiversity crisis. And I just want to say that both of those do feature very highly as driving forces within our own strategic plan. So it's really great to be here to have a few minutes to talk to you. And I was going to just put my timer on so that I don't go too over here. I would just start to introduce the Royal Town Planning Institute to you, because I appreciate many of you are members of the IES or perhaps other organisations. The RTPI is a charity and a professional institute. We have a public purpose bestowed to us by our Royal Charter, and that is to advance the art and science of town planning. It just so happens that we sell membership as well, but that isn't. We weren't set up to be a membership organisation. We were set up to advance the art and science of town planning. That said, we're now larger than we've ever been. We've got 27,000 members across the UK, Ireland and internationally, and we support planners at every stage of their careers, I often say from cradle to grave, raising the profile of professional standards, shaping policy, and ensuring that we have the highest levels of professionalism when it comes to the business of determining what goes on on land and in its broadest sense. So for over a century, we have empowered planners to have a positive impact. And part of that is obviously about creating environmentally sustainable places, but also healthy, inclusive, economically healthy as well. And very similar to your own professional body here, we're the voice of the profession. So we advocate, we support, we lead with purpose. We lead with professionalism and passion. So I think there's a lot of similarities. It's just that our area of specialism gets very detailed on the planning side of things. So, our members are really proud of the fact that they do have not just a protection role, but are there to do a positive role in creating sustainable places. And, they see their role as very much as the gatekeeper, balancing up some of those challenges on, economic, social, environmental issues to arrive at the best possible solutions. And we often say that everything starts with a plan, but also, nothing gets built, broadly speaking, without planning consent. So, that gatekeeper role is not something that our members undertake lightly. And as you will have picked up, planning is having a little bit of a moment. There's a huge spotlight on it, and it seems to be in the news daily. And just on that point, I should note, there really is an awful lot going on in planning reform at the moment. And every day when I read the news clips, as I've just done this morning, again, we have another political briefing in the Financial Times over the weekend talking about speeding up planning. And what we are seeing, and I hope Sarah won't mind me reflecting on the time that we did spend at City Hall, it was a much more sort of focused, dedicated environment on a city. And real time, certainly in the team I was in at the time, which was transport, that used to sit next to environment, we often used to joke and say, well, we'll know what we're doing the next day at work because we'll read about it in the papers the night before, the Evening Standard being the case at points in London. It does appear we're going into a similar setup now nationally, as we are getting more political briefings coming out about the direction of travel on planning reform, and more amendments, it looks, having been laid over the last few days for the planning and infrastructure bill. But we can come back a little bit more on that. So it is, planning is in a very unique role because it seems to be in the spotlight. But we would also say it's now recognised, perhaps rightly so, as a really important tool that local policymakers and national policymakers and soon to be regional policymakers have at their disposal to deliver on their objectives, which, for all intents and purposes, tends to include delivering great places that are sustainable as well as economically prosperous. So I just want to turn a little bit, if I may, on this planning and infrastructure bill and bringing it back to the agenda. We see a real opportunity through the bill to be taking a strategic approach to nature recovery. I have given evidence sessions alongside many organisations who are from the more environmental sphere than we are, more specialist. And I know that not everybody is happy with the way that things have moved along. But we do feel that, setting out a spatial development strategy framework, which, sorry to bring it back to London, but that's the framework I was schooled under, the art of being able to take a more strategic approach to policy and implementation and delivery. Having those opportunities for other elected mayors through the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, but also the English Devolution and Community Empower Bill, should provide the opportunity to take a more strategic approach to nature recovery and empower those local leaders to be much more in control of delivery in their areas than perhaps they may have been previously. Now, of course, the devil will be in the detail, and I'm sure, like yourselves, us at the RTPI will also be holding the government's feet to the fire on some of that detail, which will follow in the secondary legislation, not necessarily in the primary legislation. So the provisions are there for this establishment of a nature restoration fund, the preparation of environmental delivery plans by Natural England. And I'm on the record of saying, look, we will support it as long as Natural England are resourced to do the job properly. We have seen situations arrive in quite recent history where the best intentions were not set up to be a success. And, we had right at the start there a few comments made on biodiversity net gain. And, you don't just have to take my word for it. You can read the National Audit Office report from May 2024, which I do believe we're still waiting for a government response from, has identified, I'm sure, alongside your own work, where there are opportunities for improvement. So what we're saying is we can't have another one of those. And this is a parochial point. It's by members who are at the coalface of those planning applications, dealing with a really tricky situation to try and get something to work, but not necessarily having it resourced in a way that it could do to ensure those long-term outcomes are achieved. So we support the principle of a natural nature restoration fund, but we really will need to have some reassurance from the government that they are going to resource Natural England to do this. And I'm afraid we've seen some very recent examples beyond environmental sphere where, new powers have been given, and don't worry, we'll get on with it. We'll have enough resources. I'm talking here now about the building safety regulator who I met with 2 years ago, who assured me he would have enough people in his team to deal with all of these gateway applications. Fast forward 2 years, well, we all know what the headlines are. Now, of course, it's far more complex than that. And, if you put junk in, you get junk out. Not saying there is junk going in, but you take the point for drama here that, at the end of the day, we're not convinced that the regulator was resourced properly, and quite frankly, neither were government, which is why they're taking it back in the department. So we can't have that happen to Natural England. Number one, for credibility, part of which is our members working there. But number two, nature can't just sort of stand still and wait for the right outcomes, as you all know far better than I do. We need to have that properly resourced. So we'll be keeping a very close eye on that. But also, we're very keen to ensure clarity on how these new environmental delivery plans are going to interact with the provisions already in place for local nature recovery strategies and biodiversity net gain requirements. Now, hopefully the SDSs can join it all up. But as I say, we just don't have the detail on that. So, lots going on there, and the bill is currently going back to another reading stage. And, you'll be aware that there are an awful lot of amendments being laid in relation to environmental provisions. And we have met with various lords and baronesses who are absolutely holding the government's feet to the fire on this. And I must say, I've been through a few bills in my time, but having got particularly close to this one, because we've got our own amendments laid, 4 of them currently, when I hear the arguments of we just need to abolish the House of Lords, next time somebody says that to me, I will say, would you mind just witnessing the important work that they do on holding the government's feet to the fire on some of these bills? Because who is going to do that if we abolish the House of Lords? And I'll just leave that with you for a thought-provoking question at just gone 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. But if you're not woken up yet, you probably will be by some of my controversial comments here. So as we move on to beyond the bill, actually, just before I step beyond the bill, one of our amendments is to have a national spatial framework so that we can tie this up beyond even a regional level, but nationally. I must say it's not looking too positive on that front. I don't think the government's minded to listen to us on it, which is a shame. Scotland has one. Northern Ireland have one, for all intents and purposes. Wales have one. But it doesn't look like we're going to get it this time, but it doesn't mean that we won't stop asking for it. Now, I mentioned biodiversity net gain, and just moving it on to sort of nature recovery tools, as well as those provisions that are being brought in through the planning and infrastructure bill that I just mentioned. We have seen the introduction of BNG. And, we supported that, like I'm sure all of you did. It's a really important part of the nature recovery toolkit. But it was the insufficient skills and resourcing, particularly within local government, but also elsewhere, to manage and monitor, because that's really important, the implementation of BNG, where not everywhere, because I know that there's been some huge successes. Indeed, I've been involved in judging some competitions on some of those huge successes. But it isn't a level playing field across England. And so we have called on government to commit to ongoing monitoring of the implementation at a national level. and we've asked for an obligation for developers for them to proactively report the implementation and maintenance of off-site BNG. And, you know, that is not rocket science. It's basically what the NAO have called for as well. But unless any of you on the line here can tell me otherwise, we're not seeing that come through yet. So my next area, before I sort of move towards wrapping this up, is resourcing. So we have lost a quarter of planners over a 7-year period very recently in local government. Overall, our numbers are growing. As I say, private sector is growing. But the real gatekeeping end, where decisions are made, important discussions with the community are held, and important discussions with politicians, also that bit is now a quarter of a size smaller than it was in 2017. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary fact when you think about it. Now, that's on our recent data, but we are updating the state of the profession report again at the end of the year. So we'll have some more recent data on it to see if it's got any better, if it's stayed the same, or if it's got any worse. We suspect now, with the changes to the level 7 apprenticeship, it's about to get a lot worse, because up until this year we were churning out 200 chartered planners through the apprenticeship. 70% broadly are in local government. That tap goes off in January, and that's why we've created, not a technical term, but a bit of a hullabaloo about the funding, and we've asked government for some contingency funding for the next 2 years, because it will be the public sector that's going to be hardest hit. And I'm afraid we completely understand why the government wants to focus on NEETs and, you know, 4, 5s and 6s. But to turn the tap off on one of your milestone commitments for new planners and to help drive forward that growth, it's just deeply unhelpful at this time. And as an institute, we can't afford to fill the plug. And quite frankly, neither can local government, unless they're forced to through the levy, which they now can no longer spend on planners. I know that I'm not saying anything that you probably haven't heard before, and you're probably going to tell me it's even more acute in the environmental sector. But obviously I'm here speaking on behalf of the Institute, and my goodness, do we have a big problem. So much so we convened 30 major stakeholders to write to us, including the write to the Minister with us, including the National Trust, the Bats Protection Trust, and many other environmental organisations, who said things are going to get much harder to stay on top of in local government if we don't have this resourcing coming through. Now, to give them their dues, if the department were here, and they may well be here, they would say, but we have public practice and we have pathways to planning, which we applaud, but they've only got another year's worth of funding for that. And we need a long-term workforce strategy, which we no longer have. We've been calling for this for years, and we'll keep calling for it until we get it. Again, it exists in the nations. It doesn't exist in England. Now, moving on to environmental specialisms, this is where things obviously get far more acute, and we are acutely aware that, you know, our members who also include environmental specialists, this is where the real pinch point is in local government at the moment, and it's also the pinch point in the private sector. Half of our members are in the private sector, and they tell us the specialisms that they can't recruit to are mainly environmental. And it's really, really tough. And I think one reflection I would add is this is not unique to the UK. This is global. So when I speak to the chief executives for the Planning Institute of Australia, New Zealand, America and Canada, but particularly New Zealand and Australia, they cannot recruit to biodiversity specialists. And so we are all, you know, in a race for talent. But, you know, because of visa restrictions in the UK, that means currently some of our talent can go on fast track visas to Australia and Ireland. So again, that's something else we need to have a pragmatic discussion on with the government. The threshold they put for salary levels at the moment just won't cut it for us to get some of these really important disciplines filled. So there are lots of challenges there. But what I would say, looking to the future, is despite those challenges, despite the resourcing issues, I am feeling positive that the sector, and by that I'm talking about the broader built environment sector, which includes all of you, is looking increasingly attractive for people to come and move to, whether they're moving from university, whether they're moving mid-career or whether they're coming out of retirement, because there are some real genuinely fulfilling opportunities here. And I was reading an article over the weekend about the disconnect between the different generations, and particularly the newest generation coming forward, who are looking for not just jobs but things that help fulfill them, things that are meaningful. Well, we all know that this is a very meaningful profession. So one of the things I'm looking forward to doing in this role, but stepping into my new role, is how can we join up in the built environment to go and talk about careers as the built environment rather than as individual specialisms, because I think there's a really positive story to be had here. And so on that note of positivity, Sarah, I will pause. I'm very happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Victoria. That was absolutely brilliant. And I think really good to hear kind of your perspective, because I think a lot of us come at it from kind of the local authority members, obviously coming at from an EHO point of view and talking to planners. Sometimes that works really well, sometimes it doesn't. So it's been absolutely fascinating to see it from kind of that perspective. And thank you so much also for kind of the update around the planning and infrastructure bill and the other things. So we've got a few questions. If you've got questions for Victoria, please put them in there. And as we've got a few questions, do vote for questions you particularly want to hear answered. But I'm going to take the chair's prerogative first and ask one of my questions, although I have about 5, so I have to restrain myself. And really, I think the nub of what I kind of want to ask first is, what do planners need from us as environmental specialists in order to be able to deliver for an environment and sustainability? I know that a lot of our local authority members have mentioned that a lot of planners are quite nervous about applying adequate environmental protection because they think it's going to get overturned by an appeal. So what can we do as environmental specialists to support the planners in their efforts to kind of protect environment, improve environment and sustainability?
Well, thank you, Sarah. And I think this is one of the areas when I talk about greater collaboration and perhaps even convergence that for me, as we move another C towards greater competencies, and there's a big focus now on government about competencies in the built environment sector, not least because there's a new construction regulator coming in imminently. I think having a much closer join up, for example, I'm thinking aloud here, but some CPD modules that were very relevant about the sectors that your members are delivering on, but what is it useful for a planner to know? And we're really in the market now for producing some really quite technical content for our members, not least because we've just in the process of building a new LMS, learning management system, so that we can have a lot more bite-sized. There's a new kid on the block called micro credentials, for example, but particular issues where your members are having, there's a disconnect, some of that nervousness. It could be specifically on BNG, but it could be specifically on protected species. It could be on different areas. And I think there's an opportunity here for us to provide some content through so that planners can understand the language that you're speaking and perhaps vice versa. Because often I think where there is that nervousness, it's because everybody is so incredibly busy and they don't have time to understand what's the driving forces or what is it you're trying to achieve from this, rather than you're just trying to make life difficult. Well, we haven't got time for it, or no, we can't take that because it's going to get overturned. So, I do think there's an opportunity there to work a lot closer together on CPD content in particular, of which your members will be far closer to the detail of, these are the rub points where the planners just don't get it. Well, what I can say to you is my members would love to hear on some of those areas where they perhaps don't get it, because it may be they weren't taught it at university. Some of this arena has moved so far forward, and the whole idea of CPD is so that where we've got, changes in policy, changes in implementation, that we can help inform better and lead to those better outcomes. It's not by way of excuse, but
Oh,
yeah, but there's just been so much change in planning policy. It's hard enough for my members to keep up with what's going on in very technical planning policy, let alone wider environmental regulations that do relate to them. So I do think that if our learning and development officers are listening to this, and I'll certainly take that back to our training manager, if you've got particular things that you think would be easily transferable across. I know that my training manager is she's desperate for content at the moment, and we'd love to keep the conversation going.
Fantastic. I think that might be one for Ruth to maybe take away with her work on the planning and air quality guidance, but I think Ellie probably there's other opportunities there too. And I think that synergies, that syncs really nicely with what you've been saying about, you know, the big picture, that strategic, you know, we were talking about the spatial development framework. It's having the big picture in everybody's mind can really join these kind of different issues together. Great. I'm going to refer to the Q&A now. I'll start you with what I think is probably going to be an easy one for you, but is a popular one with us. Ruth actually asked, we've started to hear grey belt being referenced in planning. Can you explain how this differs from green belt?
Yeah, and I should preface this by saying I'm not a practicing planner anymore now, and I certainly can't give advice, but I can give you sort of an overview of what my understanding is that they are. If I had one of my members here, they would be able to quote a bit more technical detail than I'm about to. But in a strategic sense, what it is saying is there are areas of land which were previously and still are designated as greenbelt, but in some of these areas, if you can demonstrate that you meet the 5 golden rules, I think there are 5 golden rules associated with it, we would consider development that we wouldn't necessarily consider. So some of those golden rules relate to environmental considerations that we were talking about. Others relate to affordable housing. And what we are sensing from our members, because some of this is being tested in very real time with the planning inspectorate, so it is a very live issue, which is why I need to be careful what I say. But what we're hearing is, for some of our, let's just take some of our major member house builders, that they may think, well, it's worth having a go, but actually some of the restrictions are so tight now, it almost becomes meaningless on certain sites. That said, we have seen some curious decisions directly taken by the Secretary of State recently, where greenbelt development has been coming forward in a way that it wouldn't have done if the grey belt terminology hadn't been there. So it's a very live environment. There is a big driver in housing numbers, which, if I can just take a moment to reflect on that, because it's relevant for this conversation. The only reason we got into a grey belt conversation, in my personal view, is because there's a large housing target and we need to bring land forward quickly. And that was quite curious in itself, because the government won an election without housing target in July, June-July 24. But they then decided to introduce a housing target in October 24, which they didn't need to, but they're sticking with it. And that means that there's a real urgency to get lots of schemes coming forward. Now, we've always said at the Royal Town Planning Institute, it's about the right homes in the right places. And indeed, but there may well be bits of greenbelt that are very accessible train stations that would be ripe for intensification. But for us, the greenbelt conversation should really have started with more a conversation about reminding ourselves of its purpose. And, you know, there were some real clear purposes, including accessibility to it, which wasn't sorted out first. So we wouldn't have started where the government started. And, you know, if anything, you could say it was a political thing, you know, and it created a conversation. It's certainly keeping our members very busy, I will say that. so I'm not going to complain on that front, because there are many of them working for clients now on cases where they can see a window of opportunity to bring forward on this basis. But that said, some of our members, and I know this from speaking to them, have looked at it, said these rules are just so stringent now, then they're not worth it. So it's a very messy arena, Ruth, in answer to your question, that is evolving through test case law now through the Planning Inspectorate. And of course, if you're really interested in this, many of our members, including eminent planning lawyers, comment on it regularly on LinkedIn. It's a hot topic, and I'll probably leave it on that.
Thanks very much, Victoria. Right, our most popular question is actually from Christopher Fry, who's the IES chair of the Sound, Noise and Vibration Forum. And he asks, the government states that it wants the planning process shortened. Currently, LPAs have to process applications in less than 8 weeks. So how can LPAs reduce this, especially with the detailed appraisals regarding assessment of noise exposure for new housing developments?
Well, I think it's about front loading the process before you hit go on the start the planning application. So we're a big supporter of pre-application discussions and sitting down pragmatically with local authorities through a pre-application process to go through a lot of the detail, the preparatory work, so that then when you actually start the planning application process, things will go smoothly. And the reason we support that is proper planning. Unfortunately, what we're seeing, Christopher, is because of the lack of resourcing, and quite frankly, sometimes lack of decision making from local government, not our members, but politicians, we are seeing a mission creep towards planning by appeal, and that's not really proper planning work. So we would like to see, taking your specific example of noise exposure, and actually having a very pragmatic conversation with the applicant and the local authority through a pre-app, to run through the rules of the game beforehand, so that you don't have a situation where an applicant gets in a noise survey thinking that was what was wanted, and then the local authority turning around and saying, well, that's very interesting, but you've missed X, Y and Z. So for us, it's about preparation and pre-application. But unfortunately, as I say, we are seeing a bit of a creep towards, well, we'll just go straight to the inspectorate because we think we can win on appeal, which really doesn't help anybody at all. And we want to move away from that. We want to get back to proper planning.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting that somebody's already commented about environmental protection teams haven't been given the time or resources for pre-application discussion. So I think that comes back to your comment about resourcing. Now, I have got a few more questions, and I'm conscious we've only got a little bit of time. So if you've got kind of a bit of a on the spot answer, that would be fantastic. So Liz Anderson has asked, you mentioned that planning gives a voice to those who don't have one, and snails would come under that category. So how can planning help address risks when political voices are speaking far louder?
It's the legislation that helps you, Liz, and that's why it's really important that there isn't any weakening down of habitat regs or anything like that. That's a short version. So you when you're talking about protected species, the number one priority within that arena is to ensure that they remain protected, and that does require primary and secondary legislation. So, Financial Times this weekend is saying, a political briefing saying we will not touch the wildlife habitat regs. So there's a responsibility for all of us, including those in the House of Lords, to ensure that they hold that true. It's a dynamic environment.
Yes, and I think exactly, you have to have the right legislation in order to kind of hang everything else off it. I've got a question from David Rudland. It seems that planning decisions are made and then the professionals involved move on. An impractical dream, I know, but I would like to see a professional means by which designers and planners can be required, perhaps as part of CPD, to revisit schemes 5 years after completion to see their effectiveness and impact, to learn what works and what doesn't. I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, listen, many of my members do that. I mean, they love it. They get the geek out. They take their kids on holiday with them, and this is standard practice for planners. Trust me. I still drive past my early things that I did when I was I go home and visit my parents in Sussex. My father in Sussex. I was a development control officer during a summer during the 1990s, and trust me, I still drive past those to see if the fence is up or the door window withstood it or whatever. But I mean, joking apart, I'm sure it's a great idea. I'm not sure how we would require it through CPD, but we'll take it away and have a think. But I do know, because planning is a vocation as well as a profession. I'm sure many of you feel the same about your roles. It's not just a job. It becomes part of your DNA. And whenever you go on holiday or you travel around where you've been involved in schemes, I don't know many planners who wouldn't go back and have a look.
Yeah. Brilliant. And I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but I just want to say there are rumours of more planning reform coming. So I wondered if you had any comments on what that might mean for us as environmental specialists or generally.
Well, just revert back to my earlier comment. Keep an eye on what's in the newspapers, because it's coming out politically, not from the department. I genuinely feel, or departments, I feel a bit sorry for the civil servants at the moment trying to keep track of what's going on. But what it means for us is we may have to work much closer with our allies in the House of Lords, who have the only power at the moment, as far as this bill is concerned, to be helpful or be problematic to the government. I won't name certainly baronesses and lords, but there are some very helpful, experienced people within that who do not want to see their life's work undermined in any watering down of the habitat regs, for example. So I think that's an area where we're kind of all broadly aligned, and I come back to my first point, the wildlife, the environment doesn't have a voice, it needs us to give it. And the primary legislation, the secondary legislation is the tool to ensure it.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, there's some really interesting suggestions going on from the chat from the person who raised the pre-app discussions and seeing if we could allocate resources. However, I am going to direct Victoria's attention to that. And we've only got a 10-minute break, so I want to make sure we get there. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Victoria and to you all for the interesting questions. I want to say good luck for the rest of your time at the World Town Planning Institute. Maybe you can come back next year and give us an opinion on how things, a different perspective from the Chartered Institute of Buildings. So I'm going to draw this to a close now so we can have a break before the next session, which will start promptly at 10:40. So thank you so much, Victoria. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, and good luck with it all.